Welcome to week 10, everybody. So today there are a few things that I would like to discuss. More specifically, we will continue with the discussion from last week, and we will continue to analyze culture, identity, and society. But I will also like to bring something else to your attention. More specifically, some of the research in the realms of biology on one side, and neuroscience, neurobiology, more specifically, on the other side. Now, I hope that in the first 9 weeks, we had enough time to, at the very least, think of what the main parameters of the research on consciousness are, and to better equip students with a broader understanding of the topic. Now, in this introductory part to this lecture, I don't want to spend too much time on any specific etymology or concept, but simply ask you a question. If one were to ask you at this stage of your knowledge or experience, your life experience and your academic experience, what consciousness is, how would you think you will answer this question? Would you take into account scientific things, scientific research, scientific studies? Would you think of what you personally believe in? And so you might consider things such as spirituality, religion, or lack thereof. Or is there anything else? Now, we kind of tackled these questions a little bit in the weekly discussions, in the modules before. But I hope that I was able to provide you with some elements of a healthy skepticism towards certain types of research, but also certain types of assumptions. And this is where I would like to start a conversation today. I have to admit to many of you that I have been somewhat concerned about the current state of affairs in academia and in scientific research, at least in the United States, because I've been observing a pattern that is very, very similar to what happens in other areas of human endeavors, more specifically society and politics. I noticed a progressive extremism in the fields that I am involved in, and in more generally that academia is involved in. And this would not be too much of a problem, as in, I mentioned this before, scientific endeavors, scientific research should not have anything to do with politics, besides, something that unfortunately we had to take into account, which is funding. So, to some extent, whether you apply it to an NIH fund or a private donor, there are parts of that system that it will involve some politics, some fundraising at the very least. But otherwise, once you're in the lab, once you're debating, you should be free to express what you observe, right? And it's been progressively more difficult. So there are two things that I think are happening simultaneously, unfortunately, in the current state of affairs in academia. So this is relevant because in a course in psychology of consciousness, where by definition you talk about mind and matter, you see these two poles as progressively becoming more stuck in their views. So on one side, you have the thing that I feel is the most concerning, a partial or full rejection of, let's call it empirical, evidence-based science, okay? So the problem here is the rejection of this, okay? But on the other side, which is equally concerning, is another type of rejection. Rejection of non-materialistic, let's call them perspectives. Okay, perspectives. Okay, so two types of rejections here. All right. Now you might think that, at least at the very beginnings of this, there should be a debate and there should be some of a confrontation between these two. The same way as if we want to find the truth, we should be able to juxtapose things and verify whether one thing is the correct version of things and the other one is the incorrect version of things. After all, that's what is underlying the H hypothesis, HO hypothesis in statistical analysis. You need to utilize the scientific method according to the principle of falsifiability. And if you remember that the principle of falsifiability, as it implies, is simply the ability, scientifically speaking, to prove something wrong. Now, as you understand, since we're talking about psychology of consciousness, proving something wrong would also mean proving someone wrong, okay? And if I'm defending this state of affair and the research contradicts what I previously believed in, I had to give up my misconstructed belief or belief system and yield to the ultimate truth that has been proven correct, okay? Now, let's take a step back here, because you might think, okay, if this is the case, everything that the scientific research tells us should be viewed as correct. And I would agree with that. I don't think there's any rational reason to reject empirical evidence-based science. Instead of thinking about rejection, we should verify whether certain presuppositions, certain assessment of what the data indicates might be misplaced. Okay, we might make mistakes on mathematical or statistical analysis or statistical levels. In fact, this is what we will discuss next week. We will venture into some very basic mathematical logic to reanalyze some of the theories of consciousness. But otherwise, I don't think there's enough reason, rational reason that is, to reject the scientific method as a whole, which is exactly what's happening on the opposite side. What does it mean to reject a non-materialistic perspective? So the step back that I want to take with you is a step back in history, whereby a false assumption is that during certain historical periods, for the West, probably the Middle Ages, there was a completely misplaced belief in the separation between, let's say, spirituality and material science. Now, if you remember what we discussed regarding the dualistic perspective or René Descartes, you should remember this mind versus brain problem and the separation of magisteria simply as in, if you use the scientific method, you should limit yourself to what you can observe and therefore prove in the lab by observation, by senses, by the application of all the triad, right, in Aristotelian knowledge, right? So the technology, the technique, the prudence, the phronesis, and the episteme, the scientific knowledge, scientific method, okay? And I think that should be still there on one side, but on the other side, you might have something such as philosophical debate, spiritual speculation, and why not mystical experiences, okay, which might or might not overlap with this. Example, classical areas of investigation, sleep studies, okay? When you study sleep, you study consciousness by definition. When you study sleep, you also are venturing those areas such as anesthesiology, whereby it's more complicated to make the claim that we are only our bodies, that we won't go anywhere once we are detached from our perception, okay? So by definition, there are two things that are overlapping. Now, I dare to say that in this day and age, we are assisting a new paradigm. New paradigm as in a new way of looking at things. And like with every other crisis in society, a crisis is an opportunity for rebirth, reconsideration, refreshing our memories, our understanding. But like with every other crisis, it's not pleasant to witness the extremism in these positions. Now, when we study consciousness, I think that both sides of the spectrum can be projected to trying to answer one question. So, are we more than our brains? I think this is the question that we're trying to answer, at least in week 10. So we've entered into multiple things from the theoretical perspective in terms of, is consciousness the same as awareness? Can we view consciousness as action potentials? Is consciousness more a computational side of things, or is it consciousness more on a intellectual, rational, cognitively structured side of things? But at the end of the day, you should be well equipped to at least pose this question. Who are we from the perspective of consciousness? Are we our brains? And I think if you apply science correctly, you should not have any hesitation to answer the question. Yes, everything we experience in this world that we can analyze from the perspective, at least neuroscientific studies, is filtered through the brain. To believe otherwise, it's really rejecting science. And I'm being very, very skeptical of any type of claims that seems to say scientists were wrong all along. Science is an effort of repression and control and limiting our spiritual self. You should be very skeptical about this claim because, first of all, why blaming the brain? Why blaming something that, I might be biased, but we should consider a beautiful organ, an organ without which our very sense of self really falls apart. Okay, so the rejection of science is really problematic from that perspective. It's there to observe, and we cannot reject the data. But at the same time, the analysis I made 2 weeks ago, and I compared the brain to a radio transmitter, okay, or at least a radio channel, I still believe it's the best metaphor, or the simplest metaphor that's correct to understand how to bring these two together. In fact, if one were to ask you, you study consciousness, and how do you know that there is more than our brain? How do you know that what you study is correct? Well, you can view the system itself, you can follow the sequence of things to verify whether your research study, your research method, your study design correct or not. But if you really go to the more basic parts of this question, you might say, who are you in terms of what defines you as a person? Okay, and that's precisely why we started talking about identity last week. We started to talk about culture and society, because we are not islands, right? As human beings, we live in a context. And you might say, well, I can use my brain to know whether something is correct or not correct. I might be more or less correct in my assumption, but more brains working toward the same thing tell me that this is the correct state of affairs. So you might push that a little further and say, okay, so do you believe that the brain is a form of intelligence, for lack of a better term? And the answer might be, okay, what do you mean by intelligence? So let's take a look at this concept for a second. Okay, so if that is the case, if intelligence can be to some extent studied, and it's something that makes our abilities more or less likely to observe the truth and describe the truth perfectly, then the other question is, okay, where did it come from? Some might take a fully materialistic perspective and say, well, it's just by a random combination of chemical or neurochemical components that we got to the brain, okay? The brain has nothing to do with some sort of intelligence, transcendental creation, divine power. It's just a random sequence of things, neurobiologically speaking, okay? And then you might ask the question, so if you're saying that you are using your brain to study science, that your brain was assembled and works this way by a completely random assignment of things, why would you trust such a thing? Why would you trust that this thing is correct in the assumption it makes, okay? So at this point, you're not talking about me as a scientist making a certain inference or study, but it's my brain that, by virtue of these randomly assigned processes, does certain things. After all, if you want to use this metaphor, the brain as a computer, and someone were to tell you that the computer you're using is created by completely random sort of things, the processes by which it operates are also completely random, and therefore you might obtain random things. Why would you trust a computer to do some basic mathematical calculation if that were the case? Would you at least be somewhat suspicious the fact that what you claim to be random, it's either not random at all, or perhaps the fact that it is random, it's not to be trusted? So this is a question that I would like to you to ponder, okay? So it's more than just emotionality on one side, okay? It's more than just feelings, okay? I reject non-materialistic perspective because they don't make sense to me, and they're too I don't know, ethereal, okay? But at the same time, be extremely careful not to reject science on a whim because you had bad experiences with what you or someone else might perceive as callous scientism, okay? And this is interesting because the ultimate boundary of this is, okay, consciousness is more than just matter, okay, and we are more than our brains. What created us? Who created us? And it's really hard to have a course in the psychology of consciousness if, beyond everything we discussed so far in the lab, we cannot consider something such as divine power or God, okay? And there's a famous line by John Lennox, the Oxford mathematician, in a debate he had with Richard Dawkins a few years ago, where Richard Dawkins and many others that we would usually call the new atheist movement, the four horsemen of atheism. Richard Dawkins said that believing in something that's transcendental, whether you want to call it God or a religion or spirituality, believing in something like that, it's really childish because it's due to our fear of the darkness. Okay, you create a divine being, you create spirituality, you create religion, you create God because you're a child. You are afraid of things, so you create something either to pray to or to admire or to look up to in order to make up for your fear of the darkness. And John Lennon had a brilliant response saying, well, if you're claiming that religious or spiritual people are afraid of the darkness, I think that atheists are afraid of the light. And I think this is a profoundly well-structured statement, as well as a brilliant fact. So to go back to this too, you could imagine that if we were to compare the rejection of empirical science, okay? So let's call this RES, okay? Rejection of empirical science, okay? And here we'll talk about rejection of, I don't know, non-materialism, something like that, okay? It's oversimplifying things. And let's assume that this is the panel upon which every fact about reality can be projected, okay? So you have all these dots, each of which represents a fact, something that is observable, something that can be studied, something that can be replicated, something that is universal, something that it's not confined to personal interpretation, moods, or feelings. Those are all facts, independently verified, always true, and not changing. Okay? All these dots are facts. And this is a really good diagram because it has a variety of implications. If you study psychology of consciousness, you could look at this as neurons, single neurons. And based on everything we studied so far, you also know that neurons play an essential role in the way we process things in the world. But without the axons, without the bundles of connection between the neurons, then we cannot experience things. You need both neurons, you need to have axons, and you need to have action potentials to send those signals across the mechanism, right? So these two extremist views tend to do the following things. Let's assume that there are, in black, certain patterns that are too obvious to be ignored, okay? Something like that, okay? And by too obvious to be ignored, I simply mean certain patterns that are agreed upon by both sides of the spectrum. Whether you are a person who's embracing fully materialistic, reductionist, anti-spiritual, anti-religious perspectives, you see them as a fact, and you have no problem with that because, after all, you are using the scientific method to verify the truthfulness of this. But on the opposite side, if you do have a skeptical mindset within a too emotional, anti-science view, so you might still see them as such. Now, the problem is that you might have two opposite issues here, similar to what we call the false positive and false negatives, or type 1 type 2 errors. The rejection of empirical science, okay, would say that there are other connections everywhere, okay? There are other connections, but they reject them, okay? Just because science says that this is the case, okay? My, I don't know, critical theory book tells me that this is just a product of the current state of affairs. It's a product of some sort of repressive movement in society, and therefore, even if science is pretty straightforward, I will reject that there is any connection between these things. After all, we talked about that in regard to biology last week, okay? So the rejection of empirical science attempts to do this. Science is showing me something, but because of the current political state of affairs, because of my emotions, I decide, quote unquote, because this process might be subconscious, to reject that, okay? We are more than science, not because I really have good theoretical ground to discuss this, because I don't like what the science is indicating or has been indicating for thousands of years. The opposite side has also its problems. The rejection of non-materialism might say, well, I don't actually see, okay, let's assume that there are connections, something like this, okay? There are connections, there are dotted lines, okay? Like this, across the spectrum. And say, well, I cannot see any of this evidence with the current paradigm, with the current knowledge we have. And therefore, because I don't see any of these connections, I reject the existence of these connections, okay? Because they don't fit my scientific, non-scientific belief system, all right? So how to solve this problem, okay? Assuming that all these connections really mean, well, we cannot find an agreement, it seems. Well, a good idea is to start from a simplified notion of what's observed, kind of an Occam's razor. If you remember what we discussed, I think in week 2, Occam's razor, right? Occam's razor, okay? We discussed that when we were talking about the scientific method, right? How a scientific theory has to be parsimonious, as in you should not add anything that is not relevant, sufficient as necessary for the theory itself. So we should start with something that we agree because it's proven to be correct, okay? Notice, I'm not saying that we should agree on something for the sake of agreement itself. So for instance, I will not say that we need to agree to consider this part of things and this part of things equivalent, okay? Just to make everybody happy, because this part will not be happy with the other one and vice versa. I'm saying let's start with something that science is indicating as true. And at this point, it's really becoming more and more difficult to reject a lot of many things that we have observed in the lab, okay? Especially in the context of consciousness research. We are talking about research that's been done at this point consistently over the last, I would say, 50 years. I mean, the research on consciousness is part of human endeavor since time immemorial, but with the current technological apparatus, I would say good 50 years, even more so in the last 22, 23 years. I think I mentioned the research by Mario Beauregard a few times, okay? And one of his first research studies with Carmelite nuns in Montreal, that dates back to the early 2000s. So about that time. And so at the very least, it's becoming more irrational and more anti-scientific to claim that the brain does not respond to altered states of affairs, other states of consciousness in a very specific way. So at this point, if you are still embracing a fully materialistic stance of things, you might have to give up that extremist viewpoint because science itself is disproving the claim. So you need to at least be open-minded enough to consider the fact that there are more things that don't meet the eye. In fact, that shouldn't be too much of a problem unless, as a scientist, you might be afraid of being labeled too spiritualistic or too religious, because most things that we study in science, after all, cannot be seen with the naked eye. The same thing can be said about bacteria, about viruses, about neurological processes, extra potentials. You cannot directly see them with your naked eye. So it's rational to think that you should just take a step further and consider the fact that there are other things that are demonstrable with a scientific method that did not meet the eye according to the previous state of affairs, the materialistic state of affairs. Okay? Now that we established this as a truth, careful. This should not be a gotcha moment from the opposite side. Okay? You should not toss the baby with the bathwater, because the rejection of science will reject what Thomas Aquinas said in regard to the apple. You're probably familiar with that. I mentioned this a few times. He was giving a lecture in Milan, and he said, we will talk about theoretical science, about philosophy, but there are basic facts, basic scientific facts that we should no longer waste our time discussing. And he used an apple as an example. If in the crowd here, in the public, there's anybody who disagrees that this is an apple, and he was carrying an apple with him, then please feel free to leave the classroom. We will not venture into anti-scientific endeavors anymore. Okay? So this is a good start from our conversation.
And let's continue by making sure that we are indeed critical enough in neuroscience, so that we don't make those mistakes that we mentioned last week in the previous one, particularly in regard to some stereotypical understanding of culture and community. Now, we did mention that community is a much more profound term in comparison to society. It's a term that is connected to ethnocultural factors, to spiritual factors, to cohesion, connection, and empathy. And we also discussed the importance of cultural understanding and in-group perception to create both healthy boundaries on one side, but also the sense of belonging, the sense of safety. And this is connected to the conceptualization of group, family, etc. Now, if you remember, we talked about this in the context of intelligence, and we mentioned the work by Hans-Jürgen Eysenck, specifically the publication Race, Intelligence, and Education, where Eysenck claimed that a variety of intellectual differences that are observable in our culture, and in general, much of the difference observed between certain racial groups depends to a great extent on genetic factors. So we're connecting that part to this week. And again, all these fields are connected: medical anthropology, social neuroscience, cultural neuroscience, the transcultural, transpersonal neuroscience are all deeply connected. And the same is true for ethnopharmacology, which focuses on the evaluation and application of plant derivatives, ethnopharmaceutics, and ethnobotany. Now, ethnopharmaceutics study the traditional methods and techniques of preparation of pharmaceutical form, while ethnobotany analyzes the production and delivery of pharmaceutical through traditional knowledge. Those are sometimes viewed as separate fields from an academic standpoint, but they all contribute to the multidisciplinary approach of ethnomedicine. And again, keep in mind the connection between terms such as populus, popular, the Latin, folk, folkish, the Germanic, and ethnos, the Greek counterpart. Now, of course, there are other sociological and philosophical components to this. We mentioned habitus and habitat last week. We could also mention another philosopher, Habermas, who discussed or divided two different types of culture. The first type, which is understood from a general perspective, and it's not necessarily shared by all members of society. And then a second type, which is both common and political, and marked by a shared respect for rights. Now, as we are looking at ourselves, at our Western culture, despite the fact that Western, it's a construct that doesn't really provide a lot of scientific evidence, as we previously stated, as we're looking at this, also as part of our group project, which will be one of the elements of this part of the semester, keep in mind that a lot of neuroscientific approaches to psychiatry, for instance, were in themselves part of a Western, specifically Anglo-Saxon, United-based perspective, a viewpoint on psychiatric disorders. You could also call this DSM-based disorders, such as schizophrenia, but also depression and personality disorders, because what we said last week about this concept of being eradicated, being estranged from one's culture, increases the rate of these mental health disorders. So we are really talking about an eradicated culture, a culture without roots. And this is better understood, as to say, in psychoanalytic terms, particularly if we think about Jung, C.J. Jung, Carl Gustav Jung, and his perspective of the archetype or the collective unconscious, an archetype where the subject can become a stranger in a strange land, in an estranged, foreign land. The concept here is Entfremdung in the German original. This aspect has social and socioeconomic outcomes, we would say, as in the opposition to Gattungswesen. This is a term, or in the sense coined by Feuerbach and Marx. But in this specific context, there are clinical anthropological references to the quote new cross-cultural psychiatry, the one by Kleinman. And again, this cross-cultural element means that there is a crossing borders conceptualization here, which again connects us to some of the works by Levinas, for instance, the relation between the I and the other. There is a movement from the I, from myself, or the personal I, the I think, the me, the objective me, which is observed and observable. So this movement of the personal I, is towards the other, towards as in confrontation, mutual exchange. In Italian we would say in confronto a. And again, keep in mind that frontis in Latin is connected to the prefrontal cortex. So there is a cognitive component there, but it's also an incontro scontro. It's an encounter-based experience, which is founding from the cognitive perspective, but also an existential struggle, a battle. This is what Levinas defined as the other, as in other from me, which is represented by the face of the other, but also a face in general. Now, this is absolutely fundamental from the perspective of neuroscience. And neuroscience and pain, existential pain, because it has to do with empathy from a neuro correlate perspective. And I'm thinking of the research on empathy and mirror neurons, but also from a spiritual perspective. Because the consequential relationship between myself and the other person, it's a conceptual and spiritual image. It's a presentation and representation. It's an epiphany of my neighbor, the neighbor as a concept. Now, this neighbor is, of course, the other me, my peer, my correlative. And I rely on him, on this neighbor, for support of myself, of my identity, of my life and meaning, which really is connected to a divine dimension of the other, which in itself has to do with a call for personal responsibility, a movement outside ourselves, a movement toward making sure that the other is taken care of. It's a very altruistic movement, service to this neighbor. My neighbor is myself. By helping my neighbor, I am helping myself. This, of course, has to do with a religious dimension, the dimension of God that does not act directly, but via the face of the other. A God who, or a God that, and I would really emphasize the personal component here, because we're talking about the otherness, so the embodiment of God in the otherness, a personalization here, a God who has implanted, as Dimitrova wrote, God who has implanted in us a spark of reason, and no matter how much we try to step on it and extinguish it, that is impossible. Now, this is fundamental, not just because it entirely demolishes any possible clash between a spiritual religious sense of human existence or existence in general and a scientific one, but also because it provides evidence for the fact that we are combining these two things, not because we want to simplify things, but because that's exactly how our life works in the most effective way. It's the most effective way to interpret life and also to live it. Now, this actually provides a clear understanding of biology, evolutionary biology especially, because it gives a completely new understanding, which is really a mind-body connection type of understanding. It's understanding that it is not about the survival of the fetus alone, in a sense that this is an oversimplistic notion of what biology is, because again, it's a judgment outside of it, and it's a poorly constructed judgment, but it has more to do with the fact that we are meant for each other as human beings. This connection, this spark of reason that Dimitrova talks about in regard to Levinas, commits us to a search for justice inspired by charity based on this personal relation with the other than me, a relationship which is divine in nature and cannot be destroyed. This is connected to sheer biology, the biology of meaning. In this sense, I really recommend students that are interested in the soul, mind, and personhood in modern biology to watch some lectures by Professor Stephen Meredith. I will link some of this lecture below this video. Now, I would like to add something more, again, from this strictly neurobiological perspective, that this connection with the other, this understanding myself by facing the other person face this connection, it's something that has to do with me observing, seeing the other really. And some of the research that has been conducted in connection to this concept is the one of the visual, spatial, and object processing areas in the brain to investigate whether the perception of details versus broader views, or direct versus indirect gaze, especially between human subjects in a social environment, could be linked to geocultural differences. Now, keep in mind what we said in week, I believe, 1 through 3 on neural underpinnings of perception and basic neuroanatomy, specifically lateral hemispherical differences, where the right hemisphere has this more big picture type of perception, and the left hemisphere as the more analytical, detailed half of the brain, part of the brain. Now, the neuroscientific analysis covers regions such as the bilateral middle temporal gyrus, the left superior parietal gyrus, and the right superior temporal gyrus, and compares their activities to processing and activation levels in the limbic system. Now, what I want to convey here is that inferring that the above-mentioned areas are more or less activated in the execution of specific tasks, such as watching people exchanging verbal conversation or simply gazing at the person's face directly, implies the activation of more cognitive interpretative areas and a deeper level of cognitive appraisal and judgment, which is possibly the primary factor of the sociocultural component at hand. The sociocultural component, of course, understood as cognitive frameworks. Now, this is yet again another area where mind and body come together, where philosophy, spirituality, and empirical science come together, because in mental health disorders, this disorder is also a disorder in perceptual modality, in emotional modalities. In other words, individuals that are suffering from, let's say, depression are presenting mistakes, I dare to use this term, this judgment, errors in the way they perceive, they experience, they feel reality. Now, the reality in this context has to do with our perception of the world, of existence in itself, with consciousness. Now, if you think about Hegel, we mentioned this German philosopher in the context of the phenomenology of spirit a few weeks ago. He believed, for instance, that nerves were communicating patterns of consciousness, allowing impulses to be delivered throughout the system, while the brain and the spinal cord, which in modern time we define as CNS, as the central nervous system, were the immediate presence of self-consciousness, a presence self-contained, not an object, and also not transient. Now, this is connected to social neuroscience, to the connection between our perception, our emotions, and society, again, this otherness. From this perspective, the social neurological perspective, the activity of this consciousness is to be found in the activation of this system where, in society, in the social context, starting from ourselves, our core social elements, our community, but even before that, starting from the family, which is where the child develops the self in stages, including ethical stages and cognitive stages. Now, another thing I want to mention, because we just quoted Hegel here, is the conceptualization of marriage. Okay, this union. Marriage, according to Hegel, matrimony, we would say in the correct term, marriage is where male and female, these two opposites, both antithetic, and keep in mind Hegel and synthesis from not in a consequential way, of course, thesis and antithesis. So marriage is where male and female, both antithetic, join in synthetic union and produce offspring to carry on the family estate in this specific sense. Now, where the female is a domain of divine law, according to Hegel, the male is a domain of human law. So what is the synthesis? The synthesis is a practical ethic which expands to include the whole community. So this is truly important, because we're starting from our neurons, our neural underpinnings of behavior. We verify biological sequencing mechanism, and we arrive at the connection between development, family, society, and community, which is evident and observable in these experience-dependent neuromaturational processes, developmental processes, which contribute to the maturation in childhood and adolescence. Now, again, this is quite a complex topic to study. Hegel in itself, it's very, very difficult. So I'm not expecting students to master all the terms connected to Hegelian philosophy as presented in this chapter. I'm doing my best to summarize the most important part in this lecture so that you will have a sound grasp also in preparation for the assignments in this course. Maybe few terms that I would like to mention here. And again, don't worry about remembering everything in this part. Since we're talking about Hegel and we talked about the phenomenology of the spirit, the life of the spirits, I want to specify that for this absolute spirit to be there, the Dasein, be there, this contingent component, the consciousness form, this consciousness has to take different forms. It has to understand their forthcoming and remorph, change into a different shape in order to see itself. Again, this ability to see myself, my consciousness sees itself from the outside. Hegel would say als Ende und Anfang, as the end and the beginning. However, through the way of despair, this is an existential component. The way of despair in the original is the Weg der Verzweiflung. And I really want to stress this. I briefly mentioned the etymology of Verzweiflung. Verzweiflung is desperation because it's to do with internal split. We are in desperation. We are suffering as human beings because we are internally split. If you remember our conversation on the stages, from cognitive distortions all the way to paranoid ideation and psychosis, we are dissociative feature, we are internally split. And we are split if you are separated, where there's two pairs, we are despaired, Verzweiflung in German, zwei Fälle, two cases. We are at a crossroad. We are unable to see the end of the road, and we don't know which road to take. Now, I'm very passionate about this because I really value the concept of balance, of understanding, of feeling rooted, of feeling that we belong, which is the opposite of being in desperation, having two cases, two opposite roads. Everything is integrated when we feel healthy, when our emotions and our thoughts are working properly, when we feel loved, when we feel understood. However, these two cases, these two separations, can also be understood from the perspective of science. Think about what we said about the principle of falsifiability, the scientific method, right? That yes or no, it's two ways, 0 and 1. Now, in this chapter, I mentioned a presentation, a basic principle of data analysis and research methods connecting to this principle of falsifiability. To give an example here, I think of the doctrine of multi-level analysis by Kachop and Bertson, which is based on three main elements. And again, you find this in textbook. These three elements are multiple preceding condition, antecedents, 2, non-additive determinism, and 3, reciprocal determinism. In the first case, a target event on a structural level can have different triggers, either within this level or across multiple levels. In the second case, the properties of the whole are not necessarily predictable from the properties of the constituents. And in the third element, there is a reciprocal influence between biological and social factors with regard to the development of the target behavior. Now, this is extremely interesting because it connects this mathematical scientific analysis to the social context, which is exactly what we are trying to do here, moving from week 9 through this week 10 and toward next week 11 and 12, where we will talk even more about perception, because in a course on mind-body connection, we have to display, or rather be able to perceive the display of the connection outwardly as well. Now, while Kachop and Benson are considered the pioneers, the founding fathers of social neuroscience, Kachop also worked with Jean de City to better define the best research approaches in the field of social neuroscience. Now, they call this the golden triangle of human neurosciences. And this golden triangle includes 1, behavioral data, for instance, response time, choice and judgment; 2, physiological measurements, neuroimaging techniques providing correlative data of the human brain; and 3, animal model and human experiments, including lesion studies, experimental pharmacology, transcranial magnetic stimulation. And in this case, the experimental investigations allow causal inference. Now, of course, if social neuroscience investigated the relationship between society and the brain, the interaction between culture and the brain is the main focus of neuroanthropology, which is connected, of course, to medical anthropology. So these two disciplines are closely connected, to the point that their descriptors, their labels are often used as synonyms. And of course, there are connections with other fields, such as sociobiology. Sociobiology contributed to the creation of yet another synthesis, the synthesis of the whole social behavior, this time understood as the activity of a genotype directly influencing the phenotype on the basis of nature and in adaptive sense. So in this context, we can think of this connection, parallel connection between gene and meme in the context of social media, for instance. Now, given that according to sociobiologists, even social behavior is a phenotype, it is in its very nature linked to the interaction between the environment and the genotype, and it's therefore following natural selection in a neo-Darwinian sense. Now, this interaction between this environment creates a form of pressure interpreted as a selective social expectation on the individual or the group. Now, of course, this in itself can be criticized because despite the fact that it argues against a teleological component you can find in spiritual religious practices where life itself has a direction and a meaning, a direction that cannot necessarily be or should not be necessarily described as a continuous linear historical sequence. This might be more true in the context of the Judeo-Christian and Islamic world, where history is in a linear structure, as opposed to theories of the eternal return, this continuous cycle. But nevertheless has a teleological component. There's a direction and meaning, so it can be criticized because it's against this, and yet it substitutes one teleological argument for another one. And of course, there are other criticisms. For instance, thinking about Stephen Jay Gould, argued that specific traits in human behavior could be literally passed on via cultural influence, but there are also other perspectives that include a broader definition of culture. For instance, the effects of tradition on human action and ideation. Now, tradition is such an important term because it has to do with carrying over, with a transient aspect, with a continuous movement. And again, I would like to go back to this movement from myself to the other through space and time. So it's a tradition with a capital T. For students that are interested in this specific type of tradition, of course, the author's list is never ending and it touches upon perennial philosophy. So we could mention many authors, Mircea Eliade, for instance, Elimir Zola, we could mention René Guénon, many others. So sociobiologists reply that to all this criticism, they reply that natural selection plays a much bigger role in the development of all these aspects, and even if some behaviors are only in part inherited through genetic transmission, behavioral traits can be passed on to the next generation following the same rules found in general biology, such as reproduction and preservation of a specific gene in the population. And yet again, according to evolutionary fitness and adaptation, which is to some extent what psychobiology or biopsychology claim. And yet this assumption is a teleological one. It's an assumption of meaning that is fairly enough a granted opinion, but it remains such unless you can find ways to demonstrate it outside of this evolutionary theory itself. And again, this criticism from the outset is essential because we are indeed reaching a point in science where we can actually customize this evolutionary biological process. And the question asked in the textbook, the question I'm asking you is, what would happen if we could decide how to, quote, nurture nature? We always talk about the nurture-nature debate, but this is always a nurture versus nature, a nurture in front of nature, mirroring nature, confronting nature, dialoguing with nature, having a conversation with nature. But what if we use nurture as a verb and nature as a direct object? What if we could decide how to nurture nature? we're referring to the discoveries and application of the genome editing technology known as CRISPR-Cas9, which the technology was first constructed by the team of the Japanese molecular biologist Yoshizumi Shino, and then more recently by the laboratory of Shukra Mitalipov, the Kazakh biologist, currently director of the Center for Embryonic Cell and Gene Therapy at Oregon Health and Science University. Now, CRISPR stands for Cluster Regularly Interspace Short Palindromic Repeats and represents repetitive palindromic patterns of prokaryotic DNA, more specifically cascade complex genes, followed by a leader sequence, and finally by a repeat spacer array, which allows these proteins to identify, isolate, and cut off exogenous DNA. Now, in the last version of CRISPR, scientists have finally reached the ability to genetically intervene in the modification of cellular structure for the purpose of correcting. And again, this correction has a judgmental component, which doesn't have to be a negative thing, but since it's judgment, what we're talking about, it has to be outside of the process itself. Now, so this modification of cellular structure are created for the purpose of correcting pathogenic gene mutations, for instance, at the level of human embryos, or to repair or edit specific genetic sequences through the insertion of other DNA pattern. And again, we could sum up all of this from a very judgmental standpoint, as in talking about science, just because we are able to do something, just because we can do something, it does not follow necessarily that we ought to do something or that we should do something. Now, this might sound quite moralizing, just taken as such, but it's really important to understand that since we're talking about criticism, a critical neuroscientific component, when we are applying any type of technology, we are, first of all, identifying only one type of knowledge. Going back to Aristotle, right? The three types of knowledge, technology is one of these three. And also, we are making a judgment that is outside of science itself.
Well, thank you very much for your attention to week 10. So we can switch gears one more time. We discussed the impact of the psychology of consciousness field to other fields such as sociology, anthropology, philosophy, endocrinology, biology, neuroscience, etc. But I also want to be clear. We are, I would say, a good 70% into the examination of the topics of this semester, simply because I did a bit of, I chose to have a balance between empirical study, scientific study on one side, and theoretical speculation on the other side. But there's definitely more that you will analyze in week 11 through 14th. So in the next 2 weeks, we will study cognition and perception, all right? Because if we study psychology of consciousness, at the end of the day, one of the areas where we have solid scientific understanding and we can make certain claims is to understand how we understand the world, okay? To see whether our perception modalities are accurate. If they are, what they're telling us about the nature of consciousness, and they're not fully correct, there are a little bit of, there's an imprecision there, then we should account for the level of that imprecision and plug that into all the models of consciousness that we briefly examined last week. Because again, studying consciousness has to do with verifying whether something exists or not, and whether this something that we call existence can be put on a scale, on a gradient or not. So we'll do that in week 12 and 13. So week 11, we'll talk about mathematical modeling, mathematical logic. This is next week. Then we will spend 2 more weeks reanalyzing perceptual modalities, scientifically understood perceptual modalities, to see if consciousness can be viewed, understood, and therefore has some predictive power to it. And then in week 13 and 14, we'll bring everything together and we will come up with a theory that takes into account everything we said so far, and will possibly explain what consciousness is from a broader perspective, okay? And I will present to you a model that I've been working on, my team and I, for for many, many years. And then we'll ask you to reflect upon that model. Again, I won't spoil the remainder of the semester, but I just want to thank you for your attention and brace yourself because there are more things to come. But I also want to reassure you that at this point in the semester, if you were able to follow the lectures and you're able to develop some healthy skepticism on one side, but also an open-mindedness to consciousness, that you could safely assume that you will be positively surprised by the other things that we'll be discussing. And if there is an element of shock, it will not be a shock as in a disappointment, but more in a shock as in everything will come together. Okay, so I think this is a good place to conclude, and I will see you all in week 11.